Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and this is Black History Month 2018. February is Black History Month. And what we talk about in this month is the relationship to the Civil Rights Movement, to Black history, and cooperatives. And our guest this morning is a dear friend, Mr. David Thompson. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Vernon. Thank you so very much for having me on the show. Happy Black History Month.
Thank you, sir. And I'm always amazed that as an Caucasian white man from England, born in England, that you're so involved with Black history. So I have to always start with, how did you get so involved with Black history?
Well, a number of things. I think without a doubt the birth of it all is my parents had a pub in England that was near a USAF air base, and this was in the mid-1950s. And when the USAF base opened up, a lot of airmen started to come to town for the weekends. But what happened is that segregation, even though it was at the time going on in the South, also regretfully went on in England where the air bases were. And the publicans in town agreed not to serve any black airmen. But my mother and father said that they would not go along with that, and they said that they would. And so most of the black airmen used to come to our pub for a drink, and we also had rooms, and so they would stay overnight, and we became a favorite place for them. And one of the airmen was a guy called Wes, who is just a wonderful person. He may not be alive here. I don't know where he is, but anyhow, he took a shine to my brother and I, and did all sorts of things. And because there was rationing that was still going on in England at the time because of the wartime shortages, he would bring things from the base that we could not buy in the shops. And so that began a sense of, the injustice that were suffered by blacks right in our very home. And it began my interest in black history when I came to the United States and emigrated. And I think the next thing that happened was I was working as a shop steward in a restaurant in New York, and it was a restaurant that practiced the color bar. It didn't allow blacks to become waiters. They could be busboys or chefs or anything in the kitchen. And I led the effort to break the color bar at that restaurant chain, and it just got on from there.
What year was that?
1963.
Okay, I was in high school.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so and so 1950s, mid-50s, you would have been about what age?
15.
So at 15-year-old, you get to meet black men, but a very friendly, helpful men, and you particularly
we had a lot of folks that stayed at the pub, and Wes and one other family made an impression upon me. I remember we had airmen staying with us, one family in particular, and they were one of the few black families at the base, and they needed to have the family live off base, and my parents were trying to get them an apartment to live at, but they lived at the pub, and of course they were paying pretty high prices. I mean, not terribly high, but, you know, it wasn't worth it to be staying in a kind of a hotel room. And eventually we found them a place to live because, again, the color bar was, you know, no, I don't want blacks to be staying here, you know. And I was walking along the road, and they had a beautiful little daughter. And I said, you know, to my regret for the rest of my life, you know, I said, your girl is such a lovely pickaninny.
Whoa. Okay.
Thinking that, you know,
that
I
was a compliment. Okay.
Yeah. And, oh, my God. And we stopped in the road. We were on Fountain Lane. I'll never forget where and when. And he said, that is not what we call our daughter. And then he explained to me what pickaninny meant, and I apologized profusely, and I have known better than anybody what that word means, you know. So, you know, I mean, I left home at 15, so that probably would be when I was 14, you know.
Okay, David, I tell you, so you're an alien.
Yes, I am. And I think we should leave it at that, because who knows who's listening to this broadcast.
Well, you know, it's just amazing that all of us are, and that's why this immigration fight is such a sad fight, because we've had open borders and we've brought people in all kinds of different ways. But anyway, we'll keep it on co-ops and Black History Month.
Yeah.
Not immigration. Okay. But it is nice that our doors were open when you came over at 15 or 16 and worked in the restaurant in New York and got another taste of racism and what's that's like to be black in America.
Correct.
So I also know this co-op world. Did you get that in England? Is that how you got introduced to the cooperative movement?
Oh, yes. There are lots of cooperatives in England, and the co-op in my hometown, which was Boston, Lincolnshire, which is the forefather of Boston, America. The cooperatives there, we got our milk in the morning from the co-op. We got the coal from the co-op that went in the back side of the house. We shopped at the co-op for everything that we needed, and our co-op then had food and clothing and refrigerators and various other things. So the co-op was a very big part of our life, and it paid a dividend every year, and the dividend was paid just before Christmas. So Christmas always started at the co-op for everybody in our family, because we would go down and cash in the dividend, and you got a discount if you stayed there and spent it at the co-op, and therefore we got, you know, things that we've been waiting for a long time, and that was our Christmas. So the co-op was a big part of my life growing up.
So that was a consumer cooperative where the people that purchased there, that shopped there, owned the co-op.
Right. Yeah.
And you got a dividend back based on the amount that you spent over the year.
Correct.
And the amount of profit that was there, surplus.
Right. Yeah.
I guess that's another variable, is that the members would decide how much of the profit would be given back in dividends.
Yeah, the board of directors, you know, elected by the members, would, you know, make choices. The management would tell them at the end of the fiscal period, you know, how much money was left over, which would be called the profit, you know, and then the board would decide how to divide that profit up amongst the members. And you're absolutely right. The profit in a cooperative is generally directed at the member in proportion to the purchases that you made at the co-op. So the more loyal you were to the co-op, the better off you would be. And in many ways, the co-op dividend was the first loyalty program.
Okay. Hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So here we go now. You're a young man. You come over. You leave home at 15 years old. Come to America. You had this history, this understanding of what it means to be black because they opened an Air Force base close to your home. But the people in the town decided that they would honor this separation. We won't let them go to the pubs and get that real dark beer, that real black beer, that
good warm beer.
Good warm beer. But your parents then were, I don't know, progressive. I don't know what the right word is, but they said, hey, we'll let anybody come here.
That's right.
We're not going to discriminate based on anything, particular color of skin.
Yeah, I think my mother led that. She actually was conservative politically, but she thought of herself as a Christian, and she thought it was very unchristian not to allow a particular human being not to come and have the joy of being in a pub just like everybody else. So she mainly did it on her Christianity.
Okay, that's another subject we're not going to get on. People that call themselves Christians and behave so unchristian-like, but we won't go there either today. Now, right. Okay, so we still have immigration and Christianity. Okay, are those people that say they're Christians and behave badly? Now, did this cause what I was thinking of if she did it for Christian values, but did it turn out to be very good economically because you have a market that nobody else is serving? I don't know in the end, how economically it hit us. I mean, we didn't become rich because we were the only place in town where blacks could come. There weren't enough at that particular air base, to make that happen. Mm-hmm. I sense that we suffered economically because a fair number of the white customers would not come in, and so I think economically it probably had some level of a minus. Okay. But not one, where we were going to go bankrupt or anything like that. But that the impact had some measurable impact. Well, I was really hoping that there was a really positive outcome in terms of economics.
Well, the positive outcome is I got to learn about America through black people. I, got to learn about the music and the culture and the kindness of individuals, and Wes would give us, little pilot's caps to keep us warm. They had a fur thing that went over the top and mm-hmm. put it down, and so at school, wearing those things, other kids were pretty envious of us because we always had the latest black fashion.
We're going to take a break on that. We'll take our first break, and We'll come back and get into some more history, and particularly as it relates to co-ops and black history. We'll be right back.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOL and 95.9 FM.
Information is power, and that's why WOL is a great partner to have with this program, because the National Co-op Bank and everything co-op is giving you information about cooperatives such that if you use this information, you can help solve your community problems. People can come together and create businesses or find co-ops to go to. David was talking about the food shopping co-op in his neighborhood in England, which was the center of, it sounds like the center of the community. David Thompson, let's change now to history still in England. We've talked about Frederick Douglass before, but can you give us how Frederick Douglass left the U.S., ran away as a runaway slave, and then he came back as a freedman to the U.S. Give us some of that history.
Okay. Most people, of course, don't know everything about Frederick Douglass, and one of the lesser-known topics is the fact that in 1845, Douglass had published his first book, and he had become, to an element of that day, famous. And he was a fugitive slave, and that's how he represented his background. And as a result, anybody with any wish to harm him could, in essence, arrest him, take him to jail, and get a reward, probably, for recapturing a fugitive slave, and Douglass would be returned to his slave owner in Maryland. And because his poster was getting put up all over the cities where he was going to speak, his chances of being grabbed were getting larger by the day. And his friends urged him to flee to England so that he would not be captured. So in 1845, Douglass fled to England and arrived there and began a new life in England. He had left with the idea that he would one day return, but he knew at that point in 1845 he had to leave America and fled. While in England, he was there for almost 2 years. He met many people who were concerned about his status, and a conversation began in the town of Rochdale, which is where the first cooperative began, with one of the leading citizens of that town, a gentleman called John Bright, who was a member of Parliament. He and other Quakers began to join together and raise the money to buy Frederick Douglass's freedom. And that took probably around about 6 months for them to do all of that. But by December of 1846, Frederick Douglass, by manumission deeds lodged in Talbot County, Maryland, his freedom was bought, and then he was released, which is called the Act of Manumission. And as of December of that year, he was no longer a slave. And he found this out while he was in Manchester, living in Manchester and doing a lot of things in the north of England, which is where I come from. But he, for the first time, realized that he was a free man. And he wrote from that address in Manchester a most wonderful letter to somebody who had critiqued him, another American who said that he shouldn't give up being a slave, that he was wrong to accept payment for him to be free, that he ought to bear that burden and stay a slave until, slavery was abolished. And Douglass wrote, how much freer he was, how much more capable he would be for fighting for the abolition of slavery if he was able to freely and publicly go back to the United States and go to numerous places to speak and be one of the leaders in the abolition movement. So that was his time in England.
So they helped to raise money, and did he also go around speaking and making money?
Yes. He probably did quite well. He was somebody that people loved to go and see. He had a great speaking voice. He was a good speaker. He had quite a story to tell. And wherever he went and his speeches were made known, there would be fairly large crowds. I think possibly the largest crowd might have been around about 4,000 people.
Wow.
In Manchester in the Free Trade Hall. He packed the Free Trade Hall. I mean, we're talking about the 1840s. You know, there went great, grand arenas in those days. But he spoke once or twice a day on occasion. He probably spoke 2 or 3 times a week in different towns, and he had a continuous tour throughout England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland.
What's always interesting to me is that you have the people, I guess Quakers, that were against slavery, and it seems like England is a place that helped to promote slavery.
This is true.
So in every culture, you've got people on both sides, and you can see this right here in America today, both sides of the equation. Some people for justice could come out of any religious background, and then those people that are for a huge class system, that our group is right and everybody else is wrong or whatever, and I'm taken advantage of, and maybe greed is a big part of it. That is sad, but it's interesting that I knew none of this information, David, until I met you, quite frankly. And to get this history, now I'm a lover of history. I was not a lover of history going through school because all they taught us in the books were the white man's version of history. There was nothing black in there except for the scientist, Benjamin Banneker. Yeah. Was that him? Yeah. And that was the only black face in there. And I didn't even know there were black cowboys and towns with black folks that went to the west, let alone this huge history. Frederick Douglass was not in my history books. And so history was made up of give me dates and names of things, but the concepts weren't taught, and definitely people that my complexion was not in the history books that I had in school.
Right.
But now I love history and the lessons to be learned from history, so hopefully we don't make them over and over and over and over again.
Right. Well, in Lancashire, which was at that time the heart of the cotton industry, the relationship to the South was a tremendous one because Lancashire was the most productive county in England, and almost everything that Lancashire made was made out of cotton, which of course was shipped in and offloaded at the docks in Liverpool. Just as an aside, Penny Lane, of course, is one of the favorite Beatles tunes. Well, Mr. Penny, for whom the lane was named, was a slave trader. I don't think the Beatles ever knew that, possibly until much later. But Liverpool was almost the English capital of the Confederacy government. Many of the key people who played a role in the Confederacy were in Liverpool because they were using the Confederate money to build warships in Liverpool, warships that were being built for the British Navy. Alongside them were warships being built for the American Confederate Navy. So Liverpool was, a place, that I now, of course, sort of, look shamefully upon the role that it played. But on the other hand, Rochdale, which is where that first co-op began in 1844, was exactly the opposite. They would refuse to do anything that would help the South. There was huge unemployment in the town because most of the cotton mills, had to close down and went out of business during that period. But the people of Rochdale were solid behind their support of the freedom of slaves and the emancipation of slaves, and in support of the North. And there's a wonderful statue of Abraham Lincoln in the middle of Manchester, where he wrote a letter to the people of Manchester apologizing for the burden that the war had caused upon them and thanking them for their support. So it's sort of funny to be in Manchester and read a letter from Abraham Lincoln to the people of Manchester.
You know, we've got to take our second break. We've already had half of this section gone, and I'm loving it. I just told my engineer I don't want to take a break.
Yeah, go ahead. Do it.
Thank you, David. We'll get into more of the key figures in the civil rights as we go into our second half. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS and 95.9 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperatives. And we have Mr. David Thompson on the line with us this morning from California. He got up early to be on the show. Thank you, David. And, you know, I thank you earlier for giving me history lessons of American history, particularly African-American history. And it's as we celebrate Black History Month. So I also want to thank you for introducing me to Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard, who will be on next week on the program. And she wrote the book, Collective Carriage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And so I don't know if you remember, but you told me about her, you introduced me to her, and it's been a wonderful journey in learning and reading her book.
Well, she is indeed a wonderful writer and a great describer of that era in American history, and I'm really, really very fond of her.
Likewise. So, what are some of the other things that you have learned besides following Mr. Frederick Douglass?
Well, there's all sorts of things. One story that I do like telling is a story about Bayard Rustin, who was the organizer of the March on Washington. Bayard was, in his lifetime, many different things, but he was born in a Quaker family. He, at a young age, became a socialist and then later a communist. He was gay, which in the era of the 40s and the 50s was not an easy thing to be. And on top of all of that, he lived in a housing co-op in New York City. And that was a safe place for him to be. His friends always worried about his safety, and he always worried about being kicked out of an apartment because he was a renter, and it would be easy to kick somebody out if you didn't like them for any of the reasons that he was, you know. And the co-op became a safe place for him to live, a place that he couldn't be kicked out of, a place that he had an ownership. He owned a share. He had the right to occupy an apartment there. The co-op is called Penn South. It's in New York City. And it was so great a life for him there that later on, when A. Philip Randolph had been attacked in Harlem at the place where he lived, Bayard Rustin got him an apartment too at the co-op, and that is where A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin both died at that co-op, but they were safe and they were happy. They had a home, they had a community, and it was a cooperative, and it very seldom ever comes up. But the March on Washington was organized by many of the people in that co-op because Bayard was the leader and the meetings were at his co-op apartment.
So we're talking about 1960s, and 63 was the March on Washington. And
Right.
50s, was it 50s that the communist, so you got a black, gay communist.
Quaker.
Jesus.
He carried a lot of burdens.
Yeah, and I through this history of the civil rights movement, his name started popping up, and did a little research on him. But he's a powerful man, a powerful human being. Got a lot done. He accomplished a lot. I try to have a parade in D.C. coming up Pennsylvania Avenue to celebrate the American generals, the particular the Buffalo Soldiers.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and the number of African American generals and Navy folks, the admirals, and the amount of work you have to go to get a permit is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking to try to get the permits to have that speech on the mall. There was a lot of effort that people just would not know until you would try to do one. So
Right.
he had a lot done, and so it sounds like Penn South was the center of that march of getting things accomplished, and perhaps a center in New York for the civil rights movement.
Bayard. Many of the people living at that housing co-op were labor union activists and also community activists, and it was from a group of people that were living there. They all went to help Bayard, and then they all became the key staff members of the organization that put together the March on Washington. And lots of wonderful stories are told about the things that happened, there and at night after everybody got home from a long day, working on the march and having some kind of fun, et cetera, et cetera. So Penn South was for me a very important place because, in many ways, when people are organizing against the powers that be, you do need to have a safe place to be where you can go about doing your stuff, So
Mm-hmm.
Penn South was that, and I think it's the only address in America where two Medal of Freedom honor awardees both lived, because both of them were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Okay, so how big is Penn South? How many units?
I think it's around about, I seem to think either 2,000 or 3,000.
Oh, it's big.
Yeah.
And then as it's a consumer co-op too, the people that live there, the tenants that are not tenants, they're owners. So the owners that live in there are the ones that own the building, and they elect the board of directors. The members have to set policies through their bylaws and then tell the board of directors how to run it, and then they have membership meetings.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and Penn South is an interesting one from a cooperative perspective because it was begun I think it opened in about 1963, early of 63. John F. Kennedy, as president, was there at the opening. So was Eleanor Roosevelt. So was Nelson Rockefeller. Various other people. But most of those people, because it's a co-op and it's a limited equity co-op, it has always been a very low-cost place to live. And many of the residents there who joined when they were young families and in their 30s are now in their 80s, and Penn South has turned from being a family co-op in the 1960s to now being one of the largest senior housing cooperatives in the country, but it's the same people that are living there.
Did Thurgood Marshall live there also?
No, he lived in another co-op.
Okay.
Morningside Housing Co-op. He had been invited to stay there because he too was being, chased by all sorts of people and needed a safe place. So he lived at the Morningside Co-op for quite a while, and in much of the writings about his life, that co-op played a big role for him too, because he was able to provide safety to many other people, including the Little Rock group. When they came to New York, they would stay with him and be safe.
I just want, would you give us the definition of limited equity cooperative? You mentioned that, and everybody may not know what it is.
Well, a limited equity co-op is a way to create a model of a housing cooperative where the cost of living at the co-op is always going to be manageable at 30% of your income. And what it is it is a mechanism that prevents people from taking equity out of the co-op and therefore making it more expensive for the next person coming in. So the economics of it all are that over time it becomes a very affordable place to stay, and your savings over living in a rented apartment across the road become substantial, and so therefore you have a lot of wealth building that occurs on your own behalf. But because when you are leaving the co-op, you turn your share over to the next person with a small gain on your share, then the next person coming in gets to have that apartment at a cost that's affordable to them, rather than being unaffordable because so many people want to live there. So it's a great mechanism for moderate income folks, for it to stay moderate income. And in the big cities and in much of coastal America, with house prices and apartment prices going up all of the time, the limited equity co-op is about the only form of home ownership that is constantly available at an affordable cost to moderate income people.
And I find low to moderate income people, particularly if you can get a subsidy like a project-based Section 8 that goes along with it, you can get low-income people there.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know the results of limited equity co-ops in terms of how well they're managed? How good is the brick and mortar? Do they get the roofs fixed and stuff like that? Do they have enough money?
I worked for the National Cooperative Bank for a number of years and was in charge of the Western Division. And I've always had an interest in housing cooperatives because I like the idea of people having security under the roof. And my observation is that cooperatives are usually very well managed, that the residents living there take their membership seriously. They make sure that, the board complies with all of the requirements. And the board becomes the key element of, the board's job in many ways, in my perspective, is to make sure that somewhere down in the future, another 10 years later, the actions that they're taking today are going to make sure that that co-op is going to be strong 10 years from now. So a lot of it is planning, a lot of it is setting aside funds in the reserves to cover the cost of a new roof or getting everybody new air conditioning, that kind of a thing. Some co-ops don't get managed well by the residents, and that becomes a problem. Many of the larger co-ops like Penn South do hire management companies to help them do that, and that's a good idea for the larger co-ops because the paperwork and the upkeep becomes such a responsibility. But in the most, cooperatives have, HUD has different programs for condos, single-family homes, and cooperatives. And cooperatives are the part of the HUD program that loses the least money and makes the least number of claims against the insurance.
Yeah, I think that's the only one where the insurance has increased because there hasn't been a lot of failures in co-ops.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, there was a research done, we only have a minute before we take our next break, that said that they compared HUD-sponsored co-ops to HUD-sponsored apartments. In every variable, the co-op outperformed the apartments. Every variable. So I always ask the question why America doesn't put more money into the co-op housing. And that's just been an ongoing question. I have an answer. I've been told I've been cynical with my answer, but wealthy people build the apartments and then they can get the return. I have an answer. I've been told I've been cynical with my answer, but wealthy people build the apartments and then they can get the return, where that money goes to the individuals otherwise. We'll take our next break, and then we'll come back and finish up. Thank you, David.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOF and 95.9 FM.
We're back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperative. Mr. David Thompson is our guest today. David, we talked about food co-ops, and we've talked about housing co-ops. Could talk about other co-ops, but I'd like to talk about your upcoming book, Cooperatives and the Civil Rights Movement. Where are you with that, and when do I have a chance to read it?
Well, thank you for asking. It's taking longer than I had expected, and so given the way that I think things are going to go this year, it's possible that I might get it finished in 2019. But it's going very well. The problem is I get too excited about the information that I learn. I go off and start studying it, and the wonderful thing is that, when you think about this day and age, I can go to Google and I can track down so much about Frederick Douglass that I can, in many cases I have been able to track down how he spent his entire day, by different newspaper accounts and letters that people wrote and meeting notices and things like that. So I need to curb my excitement and spend more time writing than reading, but it just is too much fun.
Okay. Well, I have fun talking to you about it. So we talked about Frederick Douglass and Bernard Rustin. Is there another story, another person or period of history you want to talk about?
One of the favorite people I like to think about is a lady called Septima Clark. She was from South Carolina. She was born in Charleston. At a very young age, she became a teacher, and she went over to John's Island, which is one of the sea islands, to teach classes there. And she became part of a community that was trying to figure out how to get the vote. And this, again, would be in the 1950s. And there were a few people there who really wanted to do something about that. And they formed a consumer co-op. And one of the responsibilities you had as a member is you had to try to get the right to the vote to be registered. That was one of the duties of the co-op member. And Septima Clark worked with that group and they would take people into Charleston every day and bring them back at night to go to their jobs. And Septima Clark began to work there with a little group at the end of each day at the co-op store when they came back, showing them how to take the test for the right to vote. And one by one, they were able to do that. And Septima Clark became famous for the manner in which she taught that and the results that she had. And what she did eventually through the Highlander School and then Dr. Andrew Young, started the movement to register people in the South. And so Septima Clark started something that I think in the end led to about 3 million blacks getting the right to vote in the early 1960s.
Looks like I just Googled her, and she died 89 years old. And Septima, Septima Poinsettia Clark. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, she's one of my heroines. She was, my sense is she was a no-nonsense kind of a person. I'd probably get my knuckles rapped if I was around her.
Well, both of us.
She was firm, and she just believed strongly, and she was tremendously interested in the outcome. She knew that she would suffer most of her life for doing what she did, but she knew what the outcome would be, and the outcome, powered her personality. She taught Ella Baker and others. She taught Miss Parks.
Rosa
took
Parks.
One of her classes at Highlander, and regarded Septima Clark as one of her teachers on the road to freedom.
She became known as the Queen Mother, the grandmother of the Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King commonly referred to her as the mother of the movement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, when he was invited to Sweden, well, actually to it was to Sweden, yeah, to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, he asked Septima Clark to go with him to share the honor.
Did she go?
She did.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. See, I just learned something else. We had talked about the Highlander School before, and we had threatened to go there and visit it together at some point. I still would like to do that.
I would like to do that with you, too.
Okay, we just have to set that in motion. Okay, so you've got 2 men and a woman. Well, woman we've talked about this morning, Septima Clark, a school teacher. The pictures in here looks like she's no nonsense.
No, I look at those pictures and I think, oh boy. You better get your job done and your work done.
David, we don't have very much time left, about 4 minutes. What messages would you like to leave in this Black History Month as co-ops in the civil rights movement, or for people today, African Americans? Or what I've noted is poverty has they don't discriminate by color. Just a lot of blacks have been in poverty. But what messages would you have to give people here?
Well, first I would like to thank you, Vernon, and Pat Thornton, who works with you on all of this, for putting on this show, making this knowledge available. It is a wonderful gift of your time and your interest that you do this show, and I know how important it is to many, many people. I also think that in this particular time with, regretfully, the attitude of the president that we have, people are being mistreated unfairly and unnecessarily, and there are heightened racial tensions in the country that should not be, and we need better leadership to bring that about. So I think that we just have to power on. We have to put our shoulders to the wheel. We have to push harder. It is really important to think of, as Septima Clark in a way sort of said, just think of the outcome. If we all do the work that we want to do, if we all build stronger communities, if we all, create a fairer economy, then that will be the outcome of our life's work. And that is, you've got to keep your mind on that, keep your eye on the prize, as they say. Hope is what can drive us, but results are critical. So cooperatives are where I put my time, because I believe that is one of the best economic methods for having a fair and just economy. And that's what I want, and I know that's what you want. And, the message is just go to work.
Go to work. The good thing, it seems like co-ops have fared out well during the Depression, during bad times, hard times. People do come together and work through things together, and that's why I like co-ops. And Dame Pauline Green, who was the past president of International Cooperative Alliance, said that co-ops brings people out of poverty with dignity, and that's why I like it also.
Well, thank you, and Pat.
I want to thank you, David. I want to thank your mom.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, bless her. Well, thank you. That's a lovely thing to say.
Seriously, for being the person that she has been, to give you the view that, all people we're just human beings and treat people fairly. And gave you this view so that you step up. Both in terms of your knowledge and then sharing your knowledge. And I do look forward, if you want somebody to read the manuscript on the way to publication, then let me know. And I know how hard it is to publish a book now. I was wondering how hard it was for Frederick Douglass in 1845 to get his first book published. That must have been a really undertaking to pull the monies together, the presses together to get that done.
Well, I'll throw a quick last one in, is before he left England, another fundraiser was done for Frederick Douglass, and they raised the money that he could buy a press when he got back to the United States. So the English gave him the ability to get his word out.
Wow. Good people all over the world, no matter what the complexion, the color, the religion, or whatever, and that's why I like co-ops. The first principle is it's open to everybody, no discrimination. And the fifth principle is education, and that's what we both like, you and I, and it's creating wealth. David, thank you so very much. I appreciate you, brother. All right. Everybody have a great cooperative week, and we'll see you next week with Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhart. Thanks a lot. Have a great week.